What's going on, everyone? Welcome to the Wednesday, June 5th edition of the Ship My Money Show. I'm your host, Adam Scherer. You can follow me on Twitter at ShipMyMoney DFS. And we have a nice split slate today, 6 games in the afternoon, and we're going to talk through that early slate on this show. I'll be back later on today to talk about the main slate, but we're going to focus on those first 6 games, going game by game, as always, talking about the best pitching, hitting, stacks, all of that. As usual, if you have questions, throw them in chat. Give the video a like, subscribe to the channel. All of that stuff helps out quite a bit. We do also have a couple of weather games on this slate. The Washington game and the Philadelphia game both have weather concerns. Right now, I think they look okay. Like if the slate started right now and I had to make a decision, I'd be playing them. But it's definitely something that we're going to have to keep an eye on later on in the day. Both of those games start at 4:05 Eastern, so they certainly have the potential to really be a pain. But as of right now, they look okay, I guess. And so I'm going to talk about them. I'm going to, as of right now, play them. Starting with Atlanta taking on the Red Sox, though, in Fenway Park. So good hitters park here. Nick Pivetta on the mound for Boston. Spencer Schwellenbach is going for Atlanta. Pivetta is having an outstanding season. What's up, Josh? I don't know how to ban people from chat, so I guess you can stay. Pivetta's having a great season for Boston. Strikeouts have been phenomenal. His stuff has been great. If you look at Stuff Plus, it's phenomenal. Even in the minors this year, his Stuff Plus was better than every starting pitcher except for Paul Skeens. It's carried over to the majors. Pitching Plus is a metric that combines a lot of different things that go into pitching. Pivetta's been well above average in that as well. Striking out 30% of hitters so far this year, only walking 5%, 3.06 xFIP. It is a good hitter's park. It is a dangerous matchup against Atlanta, although not having Acuna obviously does make them look a little bit worse. But on a 6-game slate, still certainly interested in Pivetta and that strikeout upside at only 8,800. Projected for around 22% ownership. Shows up with about a 25% optimal percentage for me. So I think the ownership's pretty much correct. I don't have any issues with it. I think he looks good. Schwellenbach on the other side, I do think is going a little bit under-owned here. The Red Sox are not a bad offense, but they are injured. Tyler O'Neill and Willie Abreu, who's having a very good rookie season. Tyler O'Neill's back. Abreu is on the injured list, though. They added him yesterday, so not as injured as they had been in recent days. But at that price on a 6-game slate, I do still think he looks okay. Not a priority for me, but if you need a lower-owned guy in tournaments, I don't mind getting there. He does project to have decent strikeout stuff. Low 20s strikeout percentage in most projection models on FanGraphs. He is probably going to have some bumps in the road. He jumped straight from AA to the majors, and he only made 2 starts at AA. So this is somebody that basically hasn't pitched above A ball and is now in the major leagues facing the Red Sox in Fenway Park. So obviously there is a lot of risk here, but he is pretty cheap. There is kind of some talented but questionable mid-range pitching elsewhere on the slate as well that's getting more ownership. So I don't mind Schwellenbach as a pivot to some of those guys that we'll get to, but certainly not endorsing him as somebody I'm very confident in or anything like that. Offensively, don't mind getting to either of these offenses. It is a good park. It is a day game too. We're in June. It's a day game in Boston. The ball is generally just going to carry better as well. Temperatures today in the mid-80s, wind blowing out. So good hitters park. And that's part of the reason that the total in this game is as high as it is, even though neither pitcher is bad. Pivetta is downright good, and then Schwellenbach is probably fine. So while I am interested in the pitching, I do like the bats as well in lineups where you don't have either pitcher. So I think either offense looks fine. And the Braves are cheaper than usual as well. They haven't been hitting that well recently. The lineup, again, obviously is weaker with Acuna injured. But Riley at $5K, just a little bit cheaper price tag than you normally get. D'Arnaud, $3,800. We know how much power he gives you. Albies at $5,200 looks fine. Olson's down to $5,100. So I do like this Atlanta stack from a pricing standpoint as well. Adam Duvall gives you another power bat sub 4K. That helps you alleviate some salary as well. And then the Red Sox, of course, are even cheaper. You have some nice value showing up here with Valdez batting second at $3K. Not the best power hitter by any stretch, but he's just a cheap second baseman hitting second in a good offensive environment. Devers is expensive, but obviously really, really good. Same goes for Duran, O'Neill. Then you get some more value with somebody like Dominic Smith. So both of these offenses look pretty good. You do have a Coors Field game that keeps them from being, the best stacks on the slate, but Atlanta showing up fourth for me. Boston showing up a bit further down the list, but both offenses, look pretty good, even though neither pitcher in this game is bad. Next, we have the Cards taking on the Astros in Houston. Miles Mikolas is pitching for the Cardinals. Ronel Blanco is going for the Astros. And the fact that Blanco is, one, getting 20% ownership here, and two, showing up as optimal 16% of the time for me, really speaks to the lack of pitching on this slate, because not that he's a bad pitcher, but he is nowhere close to a $10,700 pitcher. 24% strikeout percentage, 10.5% walk percentage, 4.07 xFIP this year. He's like an $8,500 guy that is priced in the mid 10Ks and relatively popular. So it really just speaks to the pitching on the slate. This is one of the better pitching environments on the slate as well. Like we just talked about, we have good hitting weather in Fenway. That's a tough spot to trust pitching. You have a Coors Field game. Then you also just have some pitching that isn't very good. You also do have the weather concerns in those later games as well. So that's why you're seeing Blanco still show up, 15 to 20% of the time. It is a good strikeout matchup against the Cardinals as well. They're a top 5 strikeout offense against right-handed pitching this season. Actually, they dropped to 6 now, but still, good strikeout spot for Blanco. And again, he's a decent pitcher. It also speaks to there just being some underpriced hitting on the slate that makes it not as difficult to get to him. On the other side, Miles Mikolas is also getting some ownership at 6,300, which is kind of crazy to me, but also like he's showing up in 18 to 19% of the lineups I built. So it really just speaks to the value that he offers, I guess. The matchup against Houston is terrible. Mikolas isn't a good strikeout pitcher. He's not a terrible pitcher in real life. 3.93 xFIP. He's decent at preventing runs, but only an 18.2% strikeout percentage. Very difficult strikeout matchup against Houston. You do, in Houston's lineup, still not have Kyle Tucker, so it is a bit weaker lineup than usual. You look down at the bottom here. Jose Abreu has been absolutely awful this year. Trey Cabbage is in there, in place of Kyle Tucker. So obviously that's a big drop off, and that's not any disrespect to Cabbage. It's just you're not Kyle Tucker. So it is a little bit, weaker lineup than usual for Houston. Still not a good spot for Mikolas, but if you're just punting pitcher on this slate, it's fine. Houston's offense, I do think, looks pretty interesting here, given that Mikolas is getting some ownership. You're going to get a 15 to 20% on Mikolas, it looks like, and taking hitters against him is kind of appealing in that situation. 186 expected ISO allowed to lefties this year, 214 to righties, so he does give up power to both sides of the plate. The Astros, as a 5-man stack, are showing up toward the bottom, but I do think that obviously getting to Yordan Alvarez looks good. He's only 5K, so that's a really nice price tag for him. And then you do, because the Astros lineup is a bit weaker than usual, you do get some value here. Like the bottom of the order that I was just pointing to as a reason that Mikolas looks a little bit better than he otherwise would, it does open up getting to good pitching. If you wanted to pair, say, an Astros mini stack or an Astros 5-man with Blanco, it's going to be a little bit easier than usual if you use the bottom of the order, even though those hitters aren't actually particularly good. On the Cardinals side, you have very cheap pricing, and you are going up against a pretty popular pitcher in Blanco who is good but not great. So I do like the pricing on the Cardinals. I don't like them quite as much today as I did on the other slates in this series. They were a top stack for me going up against Verlander for a variety of reasons. They were a top stack for me last night going up against Arrighetti for basically the same reasons as Verlander. They don't look as good today going up against Blanco, but you do just still have that value component. Nolan Gorman in particular is very, very good at second base. He has a ton of power. He's still only $3,700. 261 expected ISO against right-handed pitching since the start of last season in 519 plate appearances. That looks really good. It's the highest mark on the Cardinals. Obviously, a lot of their veterans are underperforming so far this season, but that also has driven down the prices. That's why you see a $3,800 Arenado, a $3,900 Goldschmidt. That's a lot of just proven good major league hitters that are really, really cheap if you wanted to pay up for pitching and just hope that maybe they actually figure out how to hit today. But individually, I do really like Nolan Gorman. I like $3,200 Alec Burleson quite a bit. Brendan Donovan with multi-position eligibility looks like a good value as well. So I think those three, Donovan, Gorman, and Burleson, are the three that I would individually look at the most from St. Louis. But if you wanted to, go to some Arenado, go to some Goldschmidt, that's fine as well. Blanco has allowed a 191 expected ISO to lefties this year compared to only 100 to righties. He changed his pitch mix. He's got a changeup that he throws a lot to right-handed hitters now that he did not throw to right-handed hitters in the past. And it's been a very, very good pitch for him. So that's, just another reason on top, in addition to all the other reasons that I like Donovan, Gorman, and Burleson. They do have the platoon advantage here, and it has been an advantage against Blanco so far this season. We have a Coors Field game on this slate with the Reds still taking on the Rockies. Graham Ashcraft going for Cincinnati. Dakota Hudson going for Colorado. I don't really think there's any reason to get to Hudson. He's not a good strikeout pitcher. We have enough cheap pitching on this slate that we can get to without having to go to Hudson. Ashcraft does look decent at 6,600. He's projected for 23% ownership. He showed up 21% of the time for me. And this is just a function of price and matchup. The park itself is obviously very, very bad, but Colorado does have the fourth highest strikeout percentage against right-handed pitching this year. They have an 84 WRC plus. And if you look at the implied run totals here, a 5.1 implied run total for Colorado in Coors Field is not actually high. Like the run total is just never going to be that low. So getting it at 5.1 isn't as scary as like if this game were in some neutral park and the Rockies had a 5.1 total. That would be more concerning than seeing it here in Colorado. So that's not to say that it's like a good spot for Ashcraft. It's still Coors Field. It's not a good spot, but he at 6,600 does look fine here. He's not a great strikeout pitcher, only an 18% K percentage, 4.34 xFIP, pretty comparable from a talent standpoint, I think, to Miles Mikolas, but he is facing the Rockies instead of the Astros. Granted, he is facing them in Coors Field instead of Minute Maid Park, but I think that there's not really a big difference between those two, and the ownership bears that out as well. Obviously, you can get to either offense here, but Cincinnati is going to look better against Hudson. Hudson is good at keeping the ball on the ground, limiting power. 149 expected ISO to lefties, 165 to righties this year. Doesn't strike a lot of guys out, though, and we know that one of the big reasons that Coors is so good for offense is just the massive outfield, the elevated batting average on balls in play, in addition to the ball carrying better because of the altitude. But to counteract that, they have a massive outfield. Like the walls are very far away. So you get singles turning into doubles, doubles turning into triples. And while maybe facing Hudson isn't the best home run matchup, the whole environment is still just very, very good for accumulating fantasy points. Cincinnati looks like the top stack on the slate. It's not particularly close. The only issue is just going to be counteracting the ownership on a 6-game slate. A lot of times I handle that by using them as mini stacks more than 5-mans, but also just looking at the individual ownership, they're popular, but it's not that high. If you're going to get 18, 19% ownership on De La Cruz, that I don't think is very concerning. I think that's about where he should be. Candelario getting 21% isn't very far off what I have his optimal percentage at either. So I don't think the field is going too crazy on Cincinnati, at least in ownership projections. And we have seen the trend in recent seasons as well, where the obvious top stack just doesn't necessarily, especially in large field tournaments, get as much ownership as they would in the past, probably as a result of people paying more attention to ownership, people using sims and all of that. You're seeing like the second and third best stack frequently end up with similar ownership to that top stack. So Cincinnati's certainly going to be popular. I don't necessarily think that they're going to be popular to an extreme level that makes me, really concerned about getting to them. Colorado on the other side, certainly going to get less ownership, and they do come with negative correlation to Ashcraft, which is pretty appealing in your larger field tournaments. Anytime that you can stack against a 20% owned pitcher in Coors Field, there is just going to be value and merit to that because of the negative correlation. Ashcraft doesn't give up a ton of power, 163 expected ISO to lefties, 177 to righties, but it is still Coors Field. He's not missing a lot of bats, as I said before. So you are still going to get balls in play in a park where balls in play turn into hits more often than elsewhere. So getting to relatively low-owned Tovar, Rogers, Diaz, McMahon, Blackman, I don't have any issues with those guys. Certainly lower optimal percentages than the Cincinnati guys, but also lower ownership. So I like both sides here, kind of for different reasons, kind of for the same reasons, but not really going out on a limb, I don't think, by saying that I like the two offenses playing in Coors Field on a 6-game slate. Next, we have Jordan Hicks going for the Giants in Arizona, taking on Jordan Montgomery, who has been a shell of himself so far this season. Montgomery's only struck out 14% of hitters. 4.37 xFIP is quite a bit better than his ERA. 5.48 ERA, 4.06 FIP, 4.37 xFIP, 4.75 SIERA. Whichever one of those metrics you want to look at, it's better than his ERA by some margin. The strikeout percentage is pretty concerning. Montgomery's never been a great strikeout pitcher, but he's always been better than 14%. So you don't really love to see that. But his expected power numbers this year are still solid. 159 expected ISO to righties compared to a 205 actual ISO. So he's been pretty unlucky there. Sub 100 expected ISO to lefties. He has struck out 26.5% of lefties compared to only 11% of righties. That isn't exactly what you want to see when you're going up against a San Francisco team that most likely is going to have a right-handed heavy lineup. This is a lineup that does typically platoon, and so you're probably going to have a lot of righties in this lineup. It's not going to bode well for Montgomery's strikeouts, but you do still have a pitcher that in the past has been a decent strikeout pitcher. He's probably going to get back to those numbers sooner than later. It's very unlikely that he continues to just not strike out anybody. He's getting 15 to 16% ownership at 8K. I'm in that same range. Again, he's just another pitcher that falls into that very large bucket on this slate of like, yeah, this guy is perfectly fine. I don't think he is markedly worse than the other pitchers around him. I don't think he's better. I'm probably going to just end up spreading ownership around all of them because there's no real reason, I don't think, to have a preference. The only pitcher so far in that range that has looked like he's going under-owned to me was Schwellenbach, and obviously he has his own issues in this Fenway Park game. But, you've seen very similar ownership to Michaelis, to a very expensive Blanco, to Ashcraft in Coors. Montgomery's just another guy, and so is Jordan Hicks. This is another one that I do think is going under-owned. I don't love the matchup against Arizona. It's not a good strikeout matchup. 17th in strikeout percentage against right-handed pitching this year. They do have some guys, Corbin Carroll specifically, that have started slowly this year that are driving down their WRC+. But I think by the end of the season, this is an above-average offense. Hicks has been mediocre as a strikeout pitcher after moving to the starting rotation this season, only striking out 20% of hitters. Does have a 3.8 xFIP. My question is basically, though, like, why is Jordan Hicks getting half the ownership of Montgomery? Why is he getting, I understand the prices are different, but we have enough, different hitter pricing today that I don't think it really matters. Why is he getting so much less ownership than Ashcraft? Why is he getting less ownership than Michaelis against the Astros? So I do think that if this ownership holds on Hicks, just like with Schwellenbach, that is probably a spot where maybe I just get to a little bit more Hicks. Maybe I get to a little bit more Schwellenbach. Maybe I get to a little bit less Montgomery and Michaelis, for example, because I think the chances of success, including their salaries, are just very, very similar for all of these guys. And right now, the ownership isn't projected to be there on a couple of them. So it's not like a ringing endorsement for Hicks. It's not that I have a ton of confidence in Hicks. It's that I don't have a lot of confidence in any of this pitching. And I don't think Hicks is really any different than the guys that are getting ownership. Offensively, both teams look fine. San Francisco showing up second most in all stack types and 5-mans. Arizona showing up in the middle of the pack. You will want to be careful with San Francisco because, again, you're probably going to have some pinch hit risk here. But exactly how much pinch hit risk does depend on the exact lineup they run out there. Like, for example, if Michael Conforto is starting like he did yesterday, you have a little bit less pinch hit risk because you can't pitch it with Conforto. You saw Yastrzemski pinch hit and hit a home run late in that game. But like if you get a lineup where you're running out nothing but righties and Conforto's on the bench and Yastrzemski is on the bench, then it becomes more concerning than if one or both of them is starting. Also, just keeping in mind who the players are. Like Chapman's not getting pinch hit for. Estrada's most likely not getting pinch hit for. Solera's not getting pinch hit for. Bailey is not getting pinch hit for. Ramos certainly could, especially if you have both Conforto and Yastrzemski on the bench. Matos, same as Ramos. Schmidt could. Flores could. So these guys up here at the top, just you don't really have to worry about it. These guys towards the bottom, the risk certainly becomes higher, and the risk increases too the more lefties that do not start the game for the Giants. But from a value standpoint, they do look good. Matt Chapman just looks like a very good third base play at 4,700. Has the platoon advantage against Montgomery. Good hitter overall. Estrada, very reasonably priced. Soler's got an insane amount of power for a 4K price tag. Yeah, he's not having a great season so far this year, but we know who this guy is as a power hitter. So that's a nice price tag. Bailey's been hitting towards the top of the order, so that offers some value. Same for Ramos, even with that pinch hit risk. So from a value standpoint, the Giants look pretty good. And then for Arizona, kind of like I was saying before when we were talking about Hicks, the Diamondbacks are sort of similar to the Cardinals for me, where when you look at the salaries attached to a lot of these names, there's just a very good chance these salaries are higher by the end of the season. The pricing has come down because of some slow starts, but there is value here just based on talent. Corbin Carroll, don't know where he'll be hitting in the lineup. They moved him down to 8th a couple games ago, and then he didn't start yesterday against the lefty. But at 4,300, at the very least, he gives you a ton of stolen base upside. Maybe he figures out how to hit again and gives you home run upside as well. Jock Peterson, we know, gives you a ton of power upside at 4,200. Same goes for Suarez at 3,300. Even if the matchup isn't great for him, this is a proven power hitter in the major leagues. It's just very unlikely that he can't hit anymore. At the top of the order, Marte is just good at 4,800. You've had Gabby Moreno hitting second at 3,100. Don't know if he moves back down in the order, but that's a good price tag if he's at the top of the order. Steve in chat said, is Soler broken since the second half of last season? He's been terrible. Like, he could be, but probably not. Hitters generally, when they have the track record that Soler does, just figure it out. You're going to be right more often than not if you just project Jorge Soler as Jorge Soler than if you try and buy into like small samples of hitting, because you never know when guys are dealing with nagging injuries, or a lot of the times you don't know when guys are dealing with nagging injuries. Also, they just have mechanical issues that lead to prolonged slumps, and then they get fixed. We know that the talent is there. We know that the power is there. The absolute worst case scenario for Jorge Soler right now is that he's a $4,000 hitter who is a bad hitter but still has a ton of power. Like, it's very unlikely that Jorge Soler is just like a singles hitter. So the worst case is he's just not an above average hitter anymore overall, but he can still hit the ball really far. And even that at 4K is interesting, especially against the struggling Jordan Montgomery. So it's, the answer is always to that, questions like that going to be, I don't know. But I think best way to handle it is generally to assume that they are who they are. Good projection models are factoring in aging curves and things like that. So it's not like, you're just projecting Jorge Soler to still be 26 years old or anything. So he's most likely just, still going to perform close to the way he projects going forward. And the salary being down just eliminates a lot of that concern, just like I'm saying for this Arizona team. Do I know when these guys are going to start hitting again, or if they're going to start hitting again for sure? Like, no, I don't. But we know they probably are. And the salary is just reducing a lot of the risk in going to them. So a long way of saying, like, I think overall offensively, this is just like a mediocre game. It's not Coors Field. It's not Fenway Park. But I do think that whether it's secondary stacks or using the Giants for 5-mans, especially if you're using these guys that aren't likely to get pinch hit for, there are ways that you can just get to a lot of different bats in this game and justify it. I do think that these offenses are just underpriced really for their talent level and matchups. Now we get to the two games with weather concerns. Toga in chat said, how are you handling the weather, being that both games start last on the slate? I'm hoping that we get a little bit more clarity before this slate starts. But with the way it looks right now, I would just personally be playing them and hoping that I don't get screwed out of a lot of fantasy points. It looks like right now the Philadelphia game should be okay to start. And then it's just a matter of when exactly storms come in and if they, end the game, if they're able to just delay and then finish it. The Washington game looks like the storms will be there around start time and then clear out. So with the way it looks right now, my approach and hope is just that both of these games end up being mostly okay. Like maybe the Washington game starts late and then just plays. Maybe the Philadelphia game has a delay late in the game. I'm not going to with the information I have right now. I would not be Xing them out. They don't look risky enough for me that I would want to just be removing those two games from the slate. Obviously, everybody has different risk tolerance. And if you're playing like one lineup, I think very reasonable to just say, okay, I'm not going to screw with the weather game. But, for somebody playing multiple lineups, in my opinion, for me personally, I'm going to just hope that with the information we have right now, I'm going to just hope that the weather cooperates. I'm not making any real changes. The Mets and Nats game does look pretty appealing as well. Luis Severino facing Patrick Corbin. So we do have one of the weaker pitchers on the slate in Corbin. He's projected for 6% ownership. He's showing up as optimal, like 12% for me. This is just one of those guys that I probably don't actually get to in my lineups, even though I think he's going a little bit under-owned. I will say I don't think Corbin is like drastically different than Michaelis against Houston or Ashcraft in Colorado. I think he's worse. I don't think he's like 1/3 as likely to succeed or anything like that, but probably won't actually need to get to him. He's obviously not a good pitcher. It's not a great strikeout matchup here. He's only struck out 13.8% of hitters this year. 4.5 xFIP is like a run and a half better than his ERA, but just clearly a below average pitcher at this point in his career. Severino on the other side is another guy in that bucket of guys that should probably be around 16% owned. He has been okay this season, striking out 20% of hitters. He is walking 10%, which is too high. 4.2 xFIP, 3.91 FIP. Like he's just perfectly fine. The matchup against Washington is not the best for strikeouts. 18th in strikeout percentage against right-handed pitching. They have been below average from a production standpoint, though, with a 91 WRC plus on their active roster. Severino looks perfectly fine. He's, to me, factoring in salary and everything else, he is basically the same as like every pitcher that we have talked about, except for Pivetta being better and Hudson being worse and Corbin being worse. Other than that, every pitcher is like the same to me right now as far as their chances of being optimal at their respective salaries. And Severino is in that group. Offensively, the Mets are going to look good against Corbin. Just not a very good pitcher. And the slate's weird too, in that, we have all this pitching that I'm not comfortable with and most people aren't going to be comfortable with, but it's not that they're terrible pitchers necessarily. It's just that like, they're not great strikeout pitchers or they're in, tough pitchers parks. Corbin is one of the easiest pitchers to just say, I actually want to take bats against this guy from a talent standpoint. 205 expected ISO allowed to righties this year, 145 to lefties. So he has been much better at limiting power to lefties, as you would expect. But the pricing on the Mets is just favorable here as well. So I do expect them to be popular. I do think they look very good. I think that with the current ownership projections, they are going much more over-owned than Cincinnati is. Francisco Lindor right now is projected for more ownership than Elly De La Cruz. It's a more favorable price point without a doubt at 4,600, but it's Elly De La Cruz in Coors from the left side of the plate against the guy that doesn't miss bats compared to Francisco Lindor. I think that De La Cruz should be higher owned. Vientos is getting a ton of ownership, and he should be popular. He looks like one of the best values on the slate at 3,500. Alonso, Martinez, these guys should all be popular. Same for Marte. The pricing in this spot for the Mets is just too cheap, but I will be wary of this ownership if it doesn't come down before lock, because they look good. They don't look as good as Cincinnati, even factoring in their salaries, at least with my projections and my data. So that is something to keep in mind. I think there's a tendency to look at a team like Cincy and just be like, oh, they're so obvious, they're going to be too popular. I think a big thing is comparing, if you're going to say a team is too popular, you have to know how popular they should be or have a guess at how popular they should be. And using optimal percentages, using top stack percentages can give you that guess, that estimate. And with my numbers, I think Cincinnati is projected for like the correct amount of ownership, whereas the Mets are projected for too much. That doesn't mean they're bad plays. It just means that you need to be a little bit more careful with how much you're getting to. And in general, it means that I'm probably going to get to less than the field. The Nats going up against Severino, I do think are kind of interesting in tournaments because of their pricing. CJ Abrams, if he's in the lineup, is 5,300. We know he just gives you a ton of upside because of not only power, but stolen bases. For since the start of last season. 166 expected ISO against right-handed pitching, 154 this year, but he does steal bases, which is really nice. So at 6% ownership, he's interesting. Like, I obviously prefer De La Cruz, I prefer Lindor, but going back to the optimal percentages number, I think Lindor is like 1.5 times as likely to be the optimal shortstop compared to CJ Abrams, but he's getting 4 times the ownership, so that gap's just too big. It makes Abrams look like a good play in tournaments. Keibert Ruiz, if he's in the lineup at 2,900, is another value option at catcher. Lets you pay down, still have some semblance of talent. Severino, again, not a bad pitcher or anything, not somebody that I'm looking to go out of my way to pick on. Only a 124 expected ISO to hitters from either side of the plate, but still don't mind getting to a cheap Ruiz, a cheap Gallo, a good CJ Abrams with that stolen base upside. And then finally, wrapping things up in Philadelphia, Milwaukee taking on the Phillies. Again, this game does have weather concerns. With the information we have right now, I would be sticking with it. But we have Aaron Nola going for the Phillies. We have Aaron Ashby going for Milwaukee. Nola is projected to be the highest owned pitcher on this slate by a really wide margin, projected for 45% ownership. I think it's high. So again, I don't think he's a bad play. Like, obviously, Aaron Nola is a good play. I think he's going over-owned. 23% strikeout percentage, 3.5 xFIP this year. He's a good pitcher. He's not like an elite lights-out ace where I wouldn't be worried about the matchup against Milwaukee and where I don't care that he's $10,500. I think that at his price point, he's a better play than Ronel Blanco, ownership aside. But I think the ownership coming into him, like when you compare him to Blanco, I think he's actually getting more ownership than he deserves relative to Blanco, and then certainly relative to a lot of other pitchers as well. I think it's likely that I end up just getting a bit more Pivetta, living more in that mid starting pitcher range, and then not getting to Nola. I haven't obviously built the lineups I'm playing, so that could be wrong, but just looking at the numbers in front of me, my expectation is that's how my lineups will shake out. He is generally better at home, which this game is. Milwaukee's just a really scary matchup. 13th in strikeout percentage against right-handed pitching this year, 121 WRC plus. You do have some weather risk, again, that could impact Nola. Like, again, right now it looks like storms come in at the end of the game or maybe after the game, but if that moves up, you do have some risk there as well. Ashby on the other side, 6K. I do think he's another just solid value pitching option. Not safe in this park and matchup by any stretch, but he's had major league success before. In 2022, he struck out around 26% of hitters in the majors, dealt with some injuries, projects as like a 22, 23% strikeout guy going forward. He's been at AAA starting this year. He is fully stretched out, went 7 innings in his most recent start. He's more talented than a $6,000 salary. He's a better strikeout pitcher than Michaelis. He's a better strikeout pitcher than Ashcraft. He does have a bad matchup, but so does Michaelis, and Ashcraft is in Coors. So that's not like a limiting factor. It's just a reason that I won't have more than I will. But Ashby certainly just another solid value play. He is in that same exact range with Severino, Montgomery, Hicks, Ashcraft, Blanco, Michaelis, and Schwellenbach for me, where these guys all, I don't really have preferences other than ideally I just get the lowest owned ones because they all look pretty much the same to me in terms of their chances of being the optimal pitchers. Offensively, it is a good park for hitting. We have a lot of those on the slate. This is another one. I think Milwaukee is an interesting tournament stack. They have a lot of really good hitters, as I was mentioning. They're showing up middle of the pack in top stack percentage for me. And you just have an opportunity to get one of the best offenses in baseball this year in a good hitter's park against a pitcher that is going to be 40 to 50% owned in large field tournaments. That's a spot that I generally do like to get to. It's not going to come through all that often, but when it does, it is going to certainly have the potential to pay off very, very well for you. So you can see over here, I think Milwaukee's just going on their own. Not that they're super likely to succeed. William Contreras, like 8% to be the optimal catcher. That's not very likely, but he's only getting 3% ownership. Bryce Turang, 2% ownership, 7% to be optimal for me. You can see that across the board for Milwaukee. So I do think they're a good contrarian stack, even though they do have a tough matchup against Nola. On the other side, I don't have any issue with getting to Philly. Ashby's a decent pitcher, just like most of the pitchers on this slate, but it is a good park. It is an incredibly talented offense. Real Muto is always a high upside catcher. Schwarber and Harper obviously are always great, even lefty-lefty. So I'm interested in both stacks here. I think they're both middle of the pack. Philly has the better matchup for sure because they're not facing Aaron Nola, but Milwaukee has that added negative correlation with a large percentage of the field, which is really nice in tournaments. So to recap, the 6-gamer pitching is a mess. Nick Pivetta is my favorite pitcher at 8,800. Aaron Nola is projected to be the Fields, and I do think he is also very good. And then you just get a tier of guys that are pretty much the same to me. Ashcraft, Michaelis, Blanco, Schwellenbach, Montgomery, Ashby, Severino, Hicks. No real strong preferences there. With the current projected ownership, I do think that Schwellenbach and Hicks are interesting just because they're getting like half the ownership of the rest of that group. And I think that they're in very similar spots to succeed. I wouldn't be surprised if I end up kind of having a lot of lineups where like I have Pivetta and then it's just one of these other guys mixed in. It is a scary spot for Pivetta, but there's not really any safe spots on this slate. He is the best strikeout pitcher on the slate. I'm very happy to get a lot of him at this price. Offensively, I think the Reds look great. Their ownership is high, but pretty much in line with where I think they should be. San Francisco for value looks good, but pay attention to their starting lineup. Be aware of pinch hit risk. The Mets look like a very good team from a value standpoint and a matchup standpoint as well. They do right now look like the most over-owned team to me. In non-Pivetta lineups, certainly plenty of upside for Atlanta. And Milwaukee's my favorite contrarian stack going up against a very popular Nola with a lot of talent in a good hitter's park. So I do anticipate I'll probably be getting to them as a contrarian play in large field tournaments. That's all I have for you for the early slate. I'll be back at 4:30 p.m. Eastern for tonight's main slate, doing the same thing for that show. Thanks for checking out the show, and I'll see you all later.